If you learned C++, Pascal, BASIC, or some early programming language, one of the first things you probably learned was how to read input from the user. Now you can do this in Java as well, and it's occasionally useful. We'll talk about it on this slide, but as we'll see on the next slide, doing so is usually not very important. But it is occasionally, so let's talk about it. So if you want to read strings, one of the things you can do is use the command line arguments that are supplied to main. We did that earlier when we did the example called show to args. So if you just want to treat them as strings, you read arg sub 0, arg sub 1, but as we saw in the earlier example, make sure you check args.length so you're not trying to read off the end of the array. But what happens if you want to read a number from the user? Well, if they enter the number 7, it'll come in as a string because the argument to main is of type string array. If you try to change the type of the argument to main, it doesn't work. Only a string array will be considered the entry point for running an application in Java. So one option is to use this class called a scanner. If you make a scanner and you point it at the standard input, then there are various methods to read the next whole number or the next floating point number that the user enters. Kind of useful, but not tremendously so. Another alternative is to just use the command line arguments, but convert. So, for example, there is a method called integer.parseInt. If you take a string that looks like a number and you pass to integer.parseInt, then you get a whole number. If you do the same thing with double.parseDouble, you get a floating point number. Unfortunately, however, this brings up the problem. What if the user supplies something, but it doesn't really look like a number? If the user supplies hello and you call integer.parseInt on it, you get an exception. And we don't know how to handle exceptions yet. So although this is the right general strategy if you want to read a command line argument and treat it as a number, we don't have enough tools in our toolbox to really do this effectively yet. Fortunately, however, all of this discussion about reading stuff from the standard input is not very important in real life. Here's why. Think about where you really use Java in real life. And the answer is enterprise apps, phone apps, or desktop apps. Well, if it's a desktop app, and a phone app, in some ways counts as a desktop app where your desktop is the phone, then you have user interface controls. The reason you learned about reading from the standard input in the early days of C++, Pascal, BASIC, or Fortran, or whatever, is you didn't have graphical user interfaces. But in a desktop Java app or a phone app in Java, you have user interfaces. So if you want to get input from the user, they shouldn't type something in on the command line. Users don't even know what a command line is anymore. Instead, you should pop up a window and you should have text fields or sliders or menus and so forth. So it's still important to know how to convert from strings to whole numbers or floating point numbers, because if you read from a text field or whatever, it returns a string. But it's not important that you can do that from the standard input. And although phone apps and desktop apps are certainly important and are widely used, much more widely used are web applications. And in Java, web applications, the user interface is not even running in Java. In a web application, the user interface is running in a browser across the internet, and then a value is sent across the internet to Java where it does something with it. Now, you could imagine reading that as a string and trying to convert, and that's what you did in the old days of servlets and JSP. But in the modern web applications, in particular JSF, and an associated library widely used called prime faces, you have user interface controls that already have Java code on the back end that handles the conversion. So the point of all this is that although when you're first learning, reading command line input or reading input from the standard input from the user is useful just for practicing, it's not very important. So if you don't really understand this section about reading input, it's not that critical. You won't do it very often in real life. Okay, nevertheless, let's try it out because it is occasionally useful, and it's useful just for practice when you're first learning. So we'll make a scanner that points at the standard input. We'll read the next whole number that the user enters, and we'll loop that number of times. If they enter 5, we'll loop 5 times. If they enter 12, we'll loop 12 times. And sure enough, if they enter 5, then we'll see that we looped 5 times from 0 to 4.